Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Respected ulama, my elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. Tonight is the eve of the 21st of Muharram, 1443 after Hijri. We are gathered today for our second weekend Majalis to commemorate the martyrdom of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, his Muhammad wa ali. His family, his companions, as well as the struggles and hardship his family faced after the day of Ashura. The agenda for tonight's program will be as follows. We'll have a recitation of Salam and Marsiya by Brother Aslam Durrani. This will be followed by a Majlis recited by Hujjatul Islam, Maulana Shaykh Faiyaz Jafar. Finally, the program will conclude with Matam after the Majlis, and the Noha will be recited by Brother Zirak Shah. Before we begin the program, I'd like to make some important community announcements. I know it's Sunday evening, and I will make this as brief as possible. During these days of Azah, we will continue our weekly Thursday evening Majalis. The next Majlis will be this upcoming Thursday, September 2nd. The program will start with Salat Al-Nakriban, which will be at 7:40 p.m. After Salah, there will be a recitation of Dua Kumail, followed by Majlis, which will be recited by Hujjatul Islam Maulana Amir Mukhtar Faizi. There are weekly ladies' Majlises that take place every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. These Majalis are being addressed by Sister Maryam Ali Tahir. These Majalis will continue till October 9th, inshallah. Our next weekend Majlis will take place next weekend, September 4th and September 5th. The Majalis will be addressed by our very own Hujjatul Islam Maulana Shaykh Rizwan Arastu. The program will once again begin with Salat Al-Nakriban, which next Saturday will be at 7:35 p.m. Next announcement concerns the raffle for the ring. As you are all aware, a community member is offering a very special and unique diamond ring to the winner of a raffle draw that will take place on Eid al-Zahra. The proceeds of this raffle will go towards Baitul Ilm. The ring is made of pure gold and is surrounded by diamonds. It has a white stone in the center that comes from the grave of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Each ticket is $100. You may buy as many as you'd like to increase your chances of winning. You may contact Sister Fatima Walji or Brother Arif Hussain for further details. We are all aware of the situation that is taking place in Afghanistan. There are many refugees, many of them who are lovers of Ahlul Bayt. Baitul Ilm is partnering with other organizations to donate care packages for our Afghan brothers and sisters who are arriving here in the Midwest. Care packages will be handed out to these brothers and sisters as they arrive at our local airports. The care packages will include basic necessities, including blankets, clothes, shoes, socks, and toiletries, as well as special items for children. We have already begun collecting funds for this worthy cause. No donation is too small. Any amount is welcome. Everyone in the community is encouraged to donate. As Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, the example of those who spend in the way of Allah is like a seed of grain which grows 7 spikes. In each spike is 100 grains, and Allah multiplies his reward for whoever He wills. In order to donate to this worthy cause, please make checks payable to Imami with Afghan care package in the memo. For further questions about this, please contact Brother Jawad Hussain. Tonight's sponsor is Brother Mushtaba Akbari. There is a request from the family for Dua Sahat for Sayyid Muhammad Sardar Haider. Please recite aloud salawat for Dua Sahat for Brother Sayyid Muhammad Sardar Haider. Salawat. No. For Brother Mushtaba Akbari's father, Sayyid Shahid Akbari. For the marhumin of Brother Mushtaba's family. and for the marhumin of Sister Sabika Akbari's family, as well as all of the marhumin of those who are here today, please recite a Surah Fatiha masbukatan bis salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Bismillah. Let us begin the program. Please welcome Brother Aslam Durrani to the platform with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. एक मर्तबा और दुरूद बशीश रह गई दश्त में तन्हा तो वतन याद आया, रह गई दश्त में तन्हा तो वतन याद आया, पानी जब पाया हर एक तशना दहन आया, लेके हर चीज़ मदीने से चली थी ज़ैनब, लेके हर चीज़ मदीने से चली थी ज़ैनब, लाश पर भाई की पहुँची तो कफन याद आया, लाश पर भाई की पहुँची तो कफन याद आया, रह गई सलवात करबल की कहानी कोई भी सुनाएगा, दिल वालों की आँखों से एक दरिया बहाएगा, वो काफिला सरवर का जो शान से निकला था, सुगरा को खबर क्या थी ना लौट के आएगा, ज़हरा ज़हरा पुरसालो 72 का टूटी है कमर शैख़ की घबराना मगर अकबर टूटी है कमर शैख़ की घबराना मगर अकबर फर्जंद नबी तेरी मैयत को उठाएगा ज़हरा ज़हरा अकबर का भी पुरसा लो था हाथों के कटने का कुछ गम न दिलावर को था हाथों के कटने का कुछ गम न दिलावर को सैदानियों का पर्दा अब कौन बचाएगा ज़हरा ज़हरा अब्बास का भी पुरसा लो रोते थे अली असगर झूले में न सोते थे रोते थे अली असगर झूले में न सोते थे मादर को खबर क्या थी एक तीर सुलाएगा ज़हरा ज़हरा असगर का भी पुरसा लो मेहमान बुलाया है ऐ कूफियों सरवर को मेहमान बुलाया है ऐ कूफियों सरवर को क्या कुनबा शहीदी का पानी भी न पाएगा ज़हरा ज़हरा पुरसा लो 72 का पामाल हुआ कासे जब घोड़ों की टापों से पामाल हुआ कासे जब घोड़ों की टापों से किस तरह चचा तेरी मैयत को उठाएगा ज़हरा ज़हरा कासिम का भी पुरसा लो सरवर ने उठाए थे सब साथियों के लाशें सरवर ने उठाए थे सब साथियों के लाशें शबीर तेरा लाशा अब कौन उठाएगा ज़हरा ज़हरा शबीर का पुरसा लो। صل على محمد وآل محمد रन में जबान हुए बेकस की सवारे अकबर पे ये माँ करते हुई ज़ारे आए उठ मेरे लाल ये माँ दर्द की मारे देखो के शान से है अम्मा तुम्हारी ना तो हो दज है ना महमल ना हमारे बेटा सर खुले बलवे बेटा तुमको 18 बरस पाला था करके मेहनत सदके तुम पर से किया मैंने जहाँ के हशमत दिल में यही कहते थे बड़ी दी है खुदा ने काम आओगे मेरे होगा जो वक्त आई तो गला अपना कटाया प्यारे आप आफत से छूटे माँ को फसाया रन में Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Before I invite Hujjatul Islam Maulana Shaykh Faiyaz Jafar to the minbar, on behalf of the Bayt al-Umm community, I would like to extend my thanks to Shaykh Faiyaz for coming to Chicago to address the community. Shaykh Faiyaz has an extremely busy schedule between the good works he's involved in for his local community, as well as the time he devotes to his young family. To take time out of his busy schedule to grace us in person at Bayt al-Ilm is truly appreciated. We hope that Shaykh Faiyaz continues to visit us in Chicago in the future for his health, safety, barakah, as well as the health, safety, and barakah for his family. Please recite aloud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. With that, I would request Hujjatul Islam Maulana Shaykh Faiyaz Jafar to come to the minbar. Please welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
رحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي يا رسول الله وعلى أهل بيتك المذلومين. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي يا مولاي وابن مولاي يا أبا عبد الله يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة يا غريب يا مظلوم يا عطشان كربلاء. ما خاب من تمسك بكم والأمن من لجأ إليكم سادتي. يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز والله فوزا عظيما. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم والقول كالحق والأصدق القائلين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. لقد كان في قصصهم عبرة لأولي الألباب. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلى على محمد وآله. For those of you who were here last evening, we had the opportunity to talk a little bit about the sources of the Karbala tragedy, or what is known as the Maqtal literature, the anecdotes which speak to the epic martyrdom of our master Imam Hussain alayhi salam. And in order to summarize, we reflected upon a couple of important salient features when it comes toward understanding the science of history more broadly, and then where the reports of the tragedy of Karbala come. And we concluded by talking about the importance of reflecting upon the theme and the value of the message, but at the same time, the importance of being critical when it comes toward the literature that is presented to us. For so much of that literature that we have, which marks and speaks to the detail of the tragedy of Karbala, unfortunately has been lost over time. By the year 290 after Hijrah, like we mentioned last night, we had 30 individual texts that spoke in detail to the surrounding information leading up to the day of Ashura, the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, and that which took place after, 30 pieces of literature by the year 290 after Hijrah. Unfortunately, only one of those pieces of literature reached us today, and that is a part of the maqtal written by a man by the name of Lut ibn Yahya ibn Sa'id ibn Nakhnaf. And for today's discussion, insha'Allah ta'ala, I want to reflect upon the importance of this particular text in terms of how we understand the story of Karbala today. And I want to reflect upon this particular subject in three different dimensions. The first dimension is in terms of understanding exactly who is this man, Lut ibn Yahya, otherwise known as Abi Makhnaf. Secondly, in terms of understanding where did this individual take his narrative of the tragedy of Karbala from. And thirdly and finally, why this particular text is amongst the most important texts which speak to the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salatu wassalam. So let's jump into this dimension number one of the discussion with regards to understanding who this personality is. Again, when you go toward books of literature, when you go online even, and you type in Maqtal of Imam Hussain, or the story of the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, more likely than not, amongst the first Google searches that you're going to see on your computer, or amongst the first texts that you're going to see in a Muslim library, often are going to be this piece of literature written by this man, Lut ibn Yahya, otherwise known as Abi Makhnaf. And it's important for us to understand where he comes from and a little bit about his life, perhaps, because again, his text is so central in terms of the way that we narrate the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain, salamullah alayh. So who is this man? Lut ibn Yahya ibn Sa'id ibn Makhnaf. We see that he himself resided in the city of Kufa, but we can trace back his legacy to his grandfather, a man by the name of Ibn Makhnaf, who apparently, according to historians, met the Messenger of God in the holy city of Medina, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Allahumma salli ala. And after meeting the Messenger of God, he converted to the religion of Islam in those very early years. He was a man who was known to be of good repute, a man who was known to be loyal, and a man who was known to be brave. And according to most historians, he was an individual who also sided with Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam and lived in the city of Kufa, to the extent that two of his brothers, meaning the grand uncles of this individual, Lut ibn Yahya, they died respectively with Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, one at the Battle of Siffin and another at the Battle of Jam. We don't know much about his father, but what we certainly know about this particular personality, Lut ibn Yahya, otherwise known as Abi Makhnaf, is that he dies in the year 157 after Hijrah. Tragedy of Karbala is 61 after Hijrah. Meaning that if we estimate that he lived a life of at the very least 60 years, let's just say, that it was very possible, and we know this for sure, that he met many of those individuals who were witness to the tragedy of Karbala and the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. And what he was known as in the early Kufan community was a historian, nothing else. Which is why many people today, they wonder exactly, what did this individual believe? Who is this man? What did he believe in? Was he a Shia? Was he Sunni? What exactly was his theology? Which school of jurisprudence did he follow? And naturally, because again, he narrates to us the tragedy of Karbala and the way that we have received it, we often like to ask these questions. And when you go and you search a little bit about the biography of this individual, what you'll see is that many of those from the Ahl al-Hadith and early Sunni theological school would call him a Rafidi, would call him a Shia. While many Shias would consider him to be a Sunni, because he never openly expressed love and fidelity to the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, alayhim salam. And in reality, we have absolutely no idea what he held in terms of his theological views. But what we do know is that he was a historian. And he was particularly interested in the history of Banu Hashim. And even more specifically, those who sided with Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. Because when we talk about the term Shia, like we know in that early period, in the first century of the religion of Islam, the term Shia had many different sort of denominations connected to it. And so there was that term Shia given to anyone who supported the authority and the governorship and the Khilafah of Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali alayhi salam. Anyone who fought with Ali at Siffin was known to be a Shia of Ali, while anyone who fought with Muawiyah was known to be a Shia of Muawiyah, or the Shia of Abu Sufyan, as Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam famously calls them on the day of Ashura. And so we certainly know about Abi Mikhnaf, Lut bin Yahya, is that he was Shia in terms of the general meaning of the word Shia, meaning that undoubtedly he and his family were supporters of the authority of Ali alayhi salam, but whether or not he was an imami, someone who truly understood the position and recognized the walaya of Ahlul Bayt alayhi salatu wasalam, we're not exactly sure. And at the end of the day, for the sake of us understanding what it is that he narrates to us, it's not particularly so important for us to know what it is that he held in his heart. So in general and in summary, this particular individual, Lut bin Yahya, a man by the name of Abi Mikhnaf, was a personality from the city of Kufa, whose grandfather was a companion of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, and he was known specifically again for his intricacy and his detail and his passion towards studying the history of the legacy of his forefathers, and particularly the legacy of Banu Hashim themselves. So let's then go into part number 2, or dimension number 2 of our conversation. Lut bin Yahya, this man, Abi Mikhnaf, he writes this text known as the Maqtal of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. And according to historians, he writes maybe upwards of 25 or 27 other books, again, all dedicated toward history. He was a historian. He didn't focus on theology, nor on law and jurisprudence, nor on anything else. And what we see and why this particular text is so important is because of who Abi Mikhnaf narrated from when it comes toward the story and the tragedy of Karbala. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday, but to get into even more detail about this particular text, we see that Abi Mikhnaf, he narrates from 6 different groups of individuals. And this is, again, very important for us to understand the story and the narrative of the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam that we have in front of us today. The first group of individuals that Abi Mikhnaf, he narrates from are those who witnessed the tragedy of Karbala directly themselves. Meaning, again, he dies in the year 157. He met at least 4 or 5 individuals and personalities who lived and resided in the city of Kufa and who witnessed with their own eyes the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, likely all of them from the army of Umar ibn Sa'd. This is the first group of individuals that Abi Mikhnaf, he narrates. The second group of individuals that he narrates from are personalities who are one link away or one intermediary away from those who were present in Karbala on the day of Ashura. Let me give you a couple of examples. We mentioned a couple of them yesterday, but nonetheless, as a good reminder. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly when it comes to these individuals, a man by the name, again, of Hamid ibn Muslim. Who is this Hamid ibn Muslim? We glanced at this individual yesterday. Abi Mikhnaf does not meet Hamid ibn Muslim directly, but he knows someone who knew Hamid ibn Muslim very intimately. Hamid ibn Muslim undoubtedly was in the army of Umar ibn Sa'd on the day of Ashura. And this individual, Hamid ibn Muslim, was a regular man. We don't have any other detail about his life in the books of history. Hamid ibn Muslim, as is narrated by himself on the day of Ashura, when they enter into the tents on the night of the 11th of Muharram, Hamid ibn Muslim says that I entered with Shimr bin Dhul-Jawshan al-Badu. And we saw Ali, the son of Hussain, Imam Zain al-Abidin, in the state that he was in. And Shimr was going to kill him. And I told Shimr, I said, oh Shimr, his family has already been killed and he looks ill. Let us leave him alone. And he says that Shimr looked at me and said, and who are you? Meaning that Hamid ibn Muslim, in an army of 30,000 people, likely wasn't known. Shimr was amongst the commanders, amongst the authorities of the army of Umar ibn Sa'd. Hamid ibn Muslim was likely a regular sort of soldier in the army of Umar ibn Sa'd. Anyhow, Hamid ibn Muslim himself, through again this intermediary, is met by Abi Mikhnaf. Hamid ibn Muslim narrates so much detail about what takes place on the day of Ashura, but again, he's not the only personality. Just as a quick parenthesis, Sorry to throw too much information out there. But Hamid ibn Muslim, eventually, he rises with the Tawabin, and then later eventually also rises or attempts to rise with Mukhtar ibn Ubayd al-Thaqafi, but Mukhtar did not want him to be in his army, and he fled and he exiled the city of Kufa because he was afraid that Mukhtar was going to kill him, which perhaps gives us a little bit of insight in regards to what Mukhtar knew about Hamid ibn Muslim. Meaning that likely he was again an individual who voluntarily supported the army of Umar bin Sa'd. That's neither here nor there for the sake of our discussion this evening. Sallu ala Muhammad wa Everyone following? My apologies. So again, we talk about 6 groups of individuals that Abi Mikhnaf, he narrates from on the day of Ashura, or in regards to the tragedy of Karbala. The first are those who directly witnessed the tragedy of Karbala, just a handful of them. Secondly, those who were one intermediary away, meaning those who were present in Karbala narrated to someone else who Abi Mikhnaf knew, but at the same time they also knew those who were in Karbala. An individual or an example is that like Hamid ibn Muslim. A third individual are those personalities who were not present themselves on the day of Ashura in Karbala, but nonetheless they were around Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam and his family members and his companions prior to Ashura and after Ashura. Example, a lady by the name of Dulham, famously the wife of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn. Abi Mikhnaf, he meets the wife of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, who herself was not present on the day of Ashura, but she was able to give insight to Abi Mikhnaf, explaining to him some of those historical circumstances leading up to the day of Ashura. And again, when we narrate the tragedy of Karbala and we speak to the events that led up to the 10th of Muharram, again, remember how much detail and how much intricacy that those early scholars had to go to documenting all of these conversations. Which is why we reflect upon the words of Imam al-Hussain, or in the conversations between individuals like that of Imam al-Hussain and Lady Zainab, or like that of Imam al-Hussain and Ali al-Akbar. Again, they recognize that these personalities are the representatives of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on earth. And thus they were sure to document, to dictate, to reflect upon their words at every single stop of the way. So Abi Mikhnaf, he narrates the third group of individuals from those who were around the companions of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, but were not present themselves on the day of Ashura. Amongst those, the fourth group of individuals that Abi Mikhnaf, he narrates from with regards to the tragedy of Karbala are those who lived during the tragedy, but those who may not have necessarily spoken about the tragedy. I'll give an example. We mentioned yesterday a man by the name of Uqba ibn Sam'an. Uqba ibn Sam'an is a man who is the servant or the slave of Rubab, the wife of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. Who he himself, he narrates that I was in the company of Abu Abdullah al-Hussain every moment from when he left the city of Medina. He himself does not give details about what happens on the day of Ashura, but he tells us so much of what happens leading up to the day of Ashura. Because again, he's with Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. I'll give you one example. We often narrate on the 9th of Muharram the conversation that takes place between Imam al-Hussain and his son Ali al-Akbar. When Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, before they reach the city of Karbala, they take rest at a particular location, and the Imam alayhi salam, he wakes up stating, Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Ali al-Akbar, he goes to his father and he says, Oh Aba Abdullah, oh my father, why are you reciting this line? He says, I saw in a dream that a caravan of death is behind us. And Ali al-Akbar famously and courageously and bravely tells his father, Ya bata, awalasna ala al-haq. Are we not on the truth? We don't fear death. In order to console his father, Imam al-Hussain. Someone says it was the middle of the night. And it was in the middle of these tents at a location that they had camped out. Who narrated this conversation between Imam al-Hussain and Ali al-Akbar? This particular servant of Rubab was in the company of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, and he himself documents what the Imam alayhi salam speaks to with his son Ali al-Akbar, which is why again we reflect upon that anecdote today. So again, the fourth group of individuals that Abi Mikhnaf he narrates from are those who don't speak necessarily about the tragedy of Karbala, but those who speak to the events leading up to it and who are in the company of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. A fifth group of individuals that Abi Mikhnaf, he narrates from in his Maqta, where he narrates the tragedy of Abu Abdullah al-Hussain alayhi salam, are those where he needed multiple intermediaries. I'll give you an example. That I heard from my friend, who heard from his friend, who heard from their friend. Meaning multiple intermediaries who were witness to the tragedy of Karbala. And sixthly and finally, what is unique about the Maqta of Abi Mikhnaf is that he also includes specific reports from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wasalam, and in particular, in extension to that, many individuals from the line of Banu Hashim, from the children of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And he values their words and their perspectives in his work. The example is the fact that Abi Mikhnaf, he narrates a narration from Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala, which speaks to some detail about the tragedy of the infant son of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. Why is this such a salient feature of this piece of literature? We mentioned yesterday that many a time when these enemies return back to the city of Kufa, you are a criminal and you've committed the worst atrocity in the history of humanity. It's very hard for someone to admit that they killed the grandson of the Messenger of God. But what becomes even more difficult to narrate is that we also killed this infant son. Which is why perhaps news like that tried to be kept hidden amongst the army of Banu Umayyah. We're speculating over here, but there's enough evidence to suggest that this is a possibility. Which is why Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he narrates himself, and why the report of Abi Mikhnaf does not say we heard from Hurmala ibn Kahin, or we heard from the army of Amr ibn Sa'd that they killed the 6-month-old infant of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, but rather he presents a narration from Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam. In addition to that, we see a hadith from Imam al-Sadiq, also narrated by Abi Mikhnaf, in which he mentions the number of wounds on the body of Abu Abdullah al-Hussain. How is anyone going to have such detail from the army of Umar ibn Sa'd to count the wounds on the body of your master Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam? Except for Imam Ma'soom, toward understanding again how important this report is for the community. Collectively, when you take a look at this work and you see the diversity of reports from this particular piece of literature, again, we understand the significance and the importance and the unique position of the Maqtal of Abi Mikhnaf as we know it today in the way that we narrate the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam and his family. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala. And let's get into the third dimension. So again, we understand now who this personality is, Lut ibn Yahya. We understand who it is that Lut ibn Yahya, Abi Mikhnaf, narrates from to give us the story of Karbala. What is it, again, that gives him an upper hand toward knowing the details about the tragedy of the Imam alayhi salam? A couple of important points, again, for us to consider. Number one is that collectively and historically, our scholars have relied upon the reports of Abi Mikhnaf. The early reports of the great scholar of Arajal, a man by the name of An-Najashi, considers his reports reliable. Sayyid al-Khu'i, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, he also states that the reports of Abi Mikhnaf, this individual is a man who is known to be thiqa, he's trustworthy. And historically, again, he was recognized as a personality of good repute. He was recognized for his trustworthiness. He was recognized for understanding the details around the history and the geography around Karbala and in Kufa and so on. We mentioned that Abi Mikhnaf, he comes from Kufa. And naturally, when you come to any city or you go to visit any place, the best person to get advice from is someone locally from that particular town. So if I from New York come to Chicago and I want to eat the best possible pizza in Chicago, it's better for me to ask someone from Chicago to tell me where the best pizza is. Naturally. If I want to go to the best museum, I want to ask someone local who's able to tell me the differences between the museums so I know exactly where I should go and where I should visit, so on and so forth. When it comes to Abi Mikhnaf, he was a man who was known again to have such precision in the details that he would present in any of his historical works. So he would differentiate between a piece of land known as Ghadariya and a piece of land known as Shatt al-Furat. We know that the land of Karbala, we often use these words interchangeably. But nonetheless, he explained the details, and this location is Ghadariya. This location is Shatt al-Furat, the bank of the Euphrates. Again, in order for the one who knows and has insight with regards to geography, for them to understand, again, the details of how the armies were set up on the day of Ashura, leading up to the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain, alayhi salatu wassalam. And again, like we said, why this particular text is so important is because it is the only text that has reached us from amongst all of the early reports that mention the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain, alayhi salatu wassalam. But now the caveat, now the important point, and now the asterisk to this whole entire discussion. Like I mentioned yesterday, this particular text, the Maqtal of Imam al-Hussain, alayhi salam, narrated by Lut ibn Yahya, otherwise known as Abi Mikhnaf, the majority of it has been lost. We don't have it in front of us today. Like I said, you go online, you'll find a book known as the Maqtal of Abi Mikhnaf. You go to a library, searching for the reports around the tragedy of Karbala, and you're going to find a book known as the Maqtal of Abi Mikhnaf. Yet the consensus amongst all of our ulama, from amongst the Shia, and from amongst the Sunni, and from amongst all early historians, is that this particular text that you see online is not the actual work of Abi Mikhnaf himself, but rather it's that which has been reconstructed by many contemporary scholars in terms of us seeking toward understanding parts and glimpses into what Imam al-Hussain and his family had to endure on the day of Ashura. So At-Tabari, the famous historian, he says in the book of the Maqtal of Abi Mikhnaf, he states this and this and this. In the work of Shaykh al-Mufid, radwanullahi ta'ala alayh, he says himself that in the book of Abi Mikhnaf, he says this and this and this. Yet that particular book, written by that individual, is not in our hands. So what exactly we have from that individual, again, we seek and try and strive toward reconstructing to the best of our ability in terms of, again, getting some glimpses into the reality of the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain, alayhi salatu wasalam. Why, again, is this important? Because I tell you, my sisters and brothers, that when we talk about the tragedy of Imam al-Hussain, alayhi salam, we only have such little detail about the oppression that Ahlul Bayt, alayhi salatu wasalam, had to endure. We have glimpses from here and glimpses from there. And how much of it was lost because of political reasons? How much of it was lost because people wanted to hide what happened to Imam al-Hussain, alayhi salam? How much of those narrations of scholars like that of Tabari, who we mentioned yesterday, who were employed by the Abbasid government, thought to only present one angle of the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussain, alayhi salatu wasalam? Really, as much as we strive toward understanding everything that Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, had to endure, we can't know. We don't have that ability. We don't have that evidence in front of us. But again, what we do have at the very least is the stress from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them. Generation after generation to fixate, at the very least, to invoke some emotion in the name of Abu Abdullah al-Hussain. They said that if these governmental forces and these political authorities and all of these forces around us are not going to allow for us to narrate the tragedy of Karbala to our followers, then let us strive at every opportunity that we get to at least remember or at least remind our Shia that Abu Abdullah al-Hussain alayhi salam, he died thirsty on the day of Ashura. Every opportunity. We mentioned a couple of those opportunities that the Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam took yesterday. But we see that even in Minna, on the days of Hajj, Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, on the 12th of the month of the Hijjah, he's sitting with a group of his companions. And as they're discussing, and as they're reciting Quran and making dhikr to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he tells one of his companions, he says that your father was a well-known poet in the city of Medina. And I remember that he used to recite our merits and the fada'il of my grandfather, the Messenger of God, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He says, do you also recite some poetry? He says, yes, O grandson of the Messenger of God, I do. He says, then why don't you stand up and remember my father, Abu Abdullah al-Hussain alayhi salam. To that extent that Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida alayhi salam would spend lavishly paying companions of his, poets like that of Da'bal al-Khuzai, to recite lines of poetry in order to invoke emotion. He would call Da'bal and he would say, oh Da'bal, recite some lines of poetry and remind me of the tragedy of my grandfather Abu Abdullah al-Hussain alayhi salam. To which Da'bal would recite lines of poetry saying that, oh Fatima, if you were present near the bank of the river Euphrates and you saw your son Abu Abdullah al-Hussain in the state that he was, you would beat your cheeks. But he narrates, then I looked up and I saw my master Ali ibn Musa Rida stand up. He had removed his turban and he began to beat every opportunity to remember the tragedy of Abu Abdullah al-Hussain alayhi salatu wasalam. And really, my dear friends, when you take a look at that which Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam had to sacrifice and that which the Imam alayhi salam had to endure, how could you not be moved? How could you not be in a state of such emotion? And perhaps the most difficult moment in the life of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam was when he had to bid farewell to his son Ali al-Akbar. It is said that when Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, and I'm not going to read the whole report to you, but just to give you a couple of glimpses, that the Imam alayhi salam, when he bids farewell to his son Ali al-Akbar, he embraces him and he falls unconscious. And the Imam alayhi salam falls unconscious twice on the day of Ashura. Firstly, when his son Ali al-Akbar bid farewell to him, and the second time was when Qasim said his last farewell to his master Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. And the Imam alayhi salam, he stood at that nearby hill, watching his son Ali al-Akbar go out and fight valiantly. Ana Ali ibn al-Hussain ibn Ali, nahnu wa baytullah awla bin nabi, adribukum bis sayf ahmi an abi. He goes out, he fights valiantly, he kills 120 people until that man, he comes and he strikes the head of Ali al-Akbar. And the blood begins to gush and the blood begins to flow onto the eyes of the horse. And the horse, instead of retreating back to the tents of Imam al-Hussain, enters into the tents of Umar bin Sa'ad. One man strikes him from the right, another man strikes him from the left. But I'll leave you with this line. It is said that when Ali al-Akbar, he calls out and he states, "O my father, alayka minni salam, my last farewell be upon you." Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, he gets on top of his horse and he begins to ride toward his son Ali al-Akbar. At this moment, Sakina, she exits from the tent and she says, "Oh my father, Abu Abdullah, you're riding the wrong way. My brother Ali al-Akbar is on this side and you're riding to the opposite side." He calls out, "La tanumini hada bunayya Ali." How can you blame me? This is my son Ali. And then I'll leave you with this last line. It is said that when Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, he reaches his son Ali al-Akbar, Hamid ibn Muslim, he says, "I saw Abu Abdullah al-Hussain," and he saw his son. And you know when he hears some really tragic news, you can't feel your legs. He says, the Imam alayhi salam, he tried to remove himself from the horse, but he couldn't. His legs were frozen, so he pushes himself off the horse. And he lands on top of his son Ali al-Akbar. And he looks at his face. And Ali al-Akbar says, "Oh Abu Abdullah, oh my father, I see my grandfather Rasulullah." And he's presenting me a cup of water. And he says that after a couple of hours, he has one ready for you as well. على لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grief in our hearts, tears in our eyes. To allow for us to be amongst those who walk in the footsteps of Abu Abdullah al-Hussain alayhi salam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow for our lives to resemble the lives of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, and for our death to resemble the death of Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, and to never separate us from Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow for our love of our Master Abu Abdullah to be a means to purify our hearts and to cleanse our souls. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us his ziyarah in this life and his shafa'ah in the next life. برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطاهرين ورحم الله من قرأ سورة المباركة الفاتحة مسبوقة بالصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. الفاتحة.
Matem Hussain. Ya 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 Hussain.
Ya Hussain. Hussain, Ya Hussain, Ya Hussain, Ya Hussain, Ya Hussain, Ya Hussain. अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं अम्मा फिजा दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं कैसा है ये चरागा दिल डूबे जा रहे हैं क्या शाम आ गया है अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं नेज़ों पे जितने सर हैं एक सर है उनमें ऐसा आंखें हैं बंद उसकी और खाक पर है गिरता अब्बास का ये सर है तेवर बता रहे हैं क्या शाम आ गया है अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं सजाद का कलेजा सदपाश हो रहा है एक एक जख्म इनका इस गम में रो रहा है ज़ैनब का नाम लेकर आदा बुला रहे हैं क्या शाम आ गया है अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं नेज़े पे रो रहा है मुश्क कुशा का बेटा नामहरमों के लब पर आया है नाम मेरा। मुझको कनीज़ ज़ादे यूं भी रुला रहे हैं, क्या शाम आ गया। अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं। अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं। क्यों काफिला रुका है, बजते हैं शादियाने, लहरा रहे हैं आदा खुश होके ताजियाने। क्यों जश्न का समा है, सब मुस्कुरा रहे हैं, क्या शाम आ गया है। अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं। अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं। करने लगा तिलावत नेज़े पे इब्ने हैदर, नामों से मुस्तफ़ा के सर पर नहीं है चादर। नजरों को अश्किया की सरवर हटा रहे हैं, क्या शाम आ गया। अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं। अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं। माँ की गोदियों से लिपटे हुए हैं बच्चे, हैं हाथ रस्सियों में माँ के ऐसे जकड़े। बच्चे जो गिर रहे हैं वो मरते जा रहे हैं, क्या शाम आ गया है। अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं। अम्मा फिजा बता दे मुझको पत्थर क्यों आ रहे हैं। या हुसैन हुसैन या 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 हुसैन। सल्ली अला
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد السلام عليك يا رسول الله السلام عليك يا نبي الله السلام عليك يا محمد بن عبد الله السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين السلام عليك يا سيد الوسيين السلام عليك يا علي بن أبي طالب السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين السلام عليك يا أبا محمد الحسن بن علي المجتبى السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام عليك يا علي بن الحسين السجاد السلام عليك يا محمد بن علي الباقر السلام عليك يا جعفر بن محمد الصادق السلام عليك يا موسى بن جعفر الكاظم السلام عليك يا علي بن موسى الرضا السلام عليك يا محمد بن علي الجواد
السلام عليك يا علي بن محمد الهادي. السلام عليك يا حسن بن علي العسكري. السلام عليك يا حجة بن الحسن المهدي. السلام عليك يا صاحب الزمان. السلام عليكم يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته.
صل على